Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We'll just be starting in a few minutes. Great. Well, thank you all for joining today's webinar for the Ending Violence Against Children Hub. We're focusing on faith actors as first responders to ending violence against children. My name is Selina. I'm JLI Senior Program and Knowledge Manager. I'm going to actually hand it off to Selina Palm from Stellenbosch University. She'll be moderating this roundtable today.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Selina, and welcome to this virtual series, as Stacey said, hosted by JLI, the Joint Learning Initiative for Faith and Local Communities, and that EVAC hub exploring the role of faith actors in ending violence against children. As many of you know, this builds on key findings from our 2019 scoping study commissioned by the Hub to focus on, and we're going to be going deeper into some of those findings and drawing in this roundtable on practitioner expertise. Some of you may have joined us in February. We explored the unique role of spiritual capital in ending violence against children, and today we're digging down into faith actors as first responders to violence against children and exploring some key insights, particularly around children's mental health and psychosocial well-being. This is one of the areas identified as important, but in need of further documentation and sharing. We also feel that this issue is very important in our current COVID-19 times, where in many countries there's partial lockdown with troubling implications for many vulnerable children. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, sorry, back. Sorry, if you can just go back to the agenda, just to walk you through our agenda today. We've got an hour and a half, so I'm just going to briefly set the scene for the theme from the scoping study. And then I'm going to introduce and hand you over to Dirk, who's going to share his experiences as a practitioner and give us some tips around a faith-informed, community-based model around working with wounded children. We're then going to move into a 30-minute roundtable where we're going to hear briefly with a number of 3-minute slots from experts in organisations around 5 key themes related to this issue of faith actors as first responders. And then finally, we're going to have a Q&A session that will involve all of you. So I really want to ask you to use the chat function, either publicly or privately to me, as we go along to raise questions. So at the end, we'll have those questions. It means I can coordinate those key questions in advance for that final session. Just so everybody knows, we are recording the roundtable and it will be circulated later on. Next slide, please. Just a quick background on the EVAC Hub. You can see on the slide here, set up in 2017 and now with over 100 members around the world, forming a unique platform for the knowledge collection and sharing, building that evidence base between academics, policymakers and practitioners. And the EVAC Hub, as you can see there, that shared commitment around the core set of values and principles, and thinking about how to engage, what works and what doesn't, in order to provide recommendations for practitioners. And you can join us if you're not already a member at the JLI website. Next slide, please. The Hub has 4 co-chairs, as you can see here: Carola Eyber from Queen Margaret University, Sylvia from Arigatou, Neelam from Islamic World Relief, and Robin from World Vision International. We're welcoming Sylvia. I think she's our newest co-chair, and they're all participating in this webinar today, this roundtable. Next slide. Thank you. So as many of you will know, the Hub commissioned the scoping study in 2018 to look at the state of the evidence and the emerging issues. This explored the many roles of faith and faith actors across the prevention response continuum, and it was published in 2019 with a set of 3 reports and also 2 evidence briefs. So you can access these. We're not focusing on those today, but actually we're focusing on a theme that came out of that larger scoping study, and that information will be up at the end of this roundtable. Next slide, please. So today we're focusing on the theme of faith actors as first responders to ending violence against children. And I'm just going to introduce that, and then we're going to dive deeply into the practitioners. So I'm going to be as quick as possible. So forgive the very busy slide. The first thing to say is that the 2019 scoping study highlighted that faith actors played diverse and dynamic roles across the prevention response continuum. They're not just doing one thing in one area, but they're actually responding in many, many different ways across that whole continuum. There's lots of points of intervention there across multiple levels of what we know to be the socio-ecological system within which children sit. Individuals, families, communities, national, international, are all of the ways in which faith actors can play roles. Secondly, faith leaders can often bridge gaps between formal and informal child protection systems. They form a long-term and often highly trusted presence in local communities for adults, but also in the lives of children. They're often accompanying those children and adults over their life cycle, and can frequently be the first port of call in an informal setting for advice, counselling, or help, for safety nets, provision of help, and even for services. So they can connect in to that more formal system. And this leads me to the third point, the importance of what's been termed and was termed in the scoping study a triage role on violence against children, recognising, reporting abuse, but also responding or referring appropriately. And the important point to see here is that faith actors and faith leaders should not be expected to do everything or to become experts around childcare and preventing child violence. They need to form part of a wider community-based child protection system. But they do form a trusted presence. They may often be the first and sometimes the only person that may notice, or that somebody will be prepared to report abuse or violence to. And therefore they're key in terms of how they choose to respond. They have a pre-existing relationship often with people. One of the most moving moments in my research for the scoping study was when one of the interviewees revealed that she had grown up in an abusive household, where her faith leader had visited every week and known that something was wrong in the household, but had never acted. When they became an adult, they visited that same faith leader to ask him why he failed to act. And he said that he knew something was wrong, but did not know what to do. We see, therefore, that capacitating faith leaders is essential if they are to play this triage role effectively and actually be able to refer and know who to refer to. Faith actors can also offer family support and capacity building on positive parenting. Many of these families are sitting in their congregations or in their places of workshop, and positive parenting skills was identified as a key issue around ending violence against children, building healthy households, and providing spiritual support around the questions that parents may have. Finally, we see faith's important role in the ongoing accompaniment of child survivors. Children who are survivors of different forms of violence, helping those children to heal and to build resilience in survivor-centered responses. This is often a longer-term project, and faith stories and beliefs can play an important role in building resilience. And Dirk's really going to talk to us with concrete examples a lot more about that role in building spiritual resilience. So these were all things that came out of the scoping study in 2019. But of course, at the moment, we're living in these highly unusual times around COVID-19. And we all know that actually at the moment, children are under increased risks, particularly of home-related violence due to the COVID-related lockdowns. We already know that children are most at risk from caregivers and in their homes, especially younger children. And we see how COVID-19 is potentially exacerbating this. At the same time, we know that children and caregivers are both experiencing higher levels of stress and even of trauma, issues such as illness, fear of poverty and loss of livelihood, or bereavement, as well as being trapped in homes potentially with abusive perpetrators. We're seeing a loss, particularly in South Africa, where I'm based, of formal services, where child abuse might be noticed, identified or reported. Schools are closed, ECD centres are closed. Many visitors to homes can no longer visit. And in many places, places of worship are currently closed. Faith leaders and faith communities can, however, continue to play important roles here, as we're going to hear, as trusted first responders at family level. They can call to check in. There's many forms of virtual support that they could provide. And it's very important that we understand that this does not have to be face-to-face. And it's important that churches, mosques and temples and other places of worship hold to the principle to do no harm in the context of COVID-19. Our roundtable is going to explore 5 themes related to the idea of faith actors as first responders. These are child participation, community support, this triage role that I've spoken about, and the important role around bridging gaps, and that role in the mental health and psychosocial support to children at all points of the continuum, but particularly for wounded children who need to heal. At the heart of the study emerge key questions about how the relationship between children and adults is viewed. Harmful beliefs that saw the child as less than, or expectations of one-way respect and hierarchical relationships could view the child as property within the family. Instead, it was seen that it's important to move to models of mutual respect. And to help us do that today, I want to introduce our main speaker, Dirk Coetsee. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Dirk studied psychology and theology at the University of Stellenbosch here in South Africa, where I'm also based, and holds a master's in pastoral counselling. He served as a Christian minister of religion in a rural community in South Africa for 12 years, and he joined the Petra Institute in 1999. And you can find out more about that on the link on the slides. Petra Institute is a faith-based, non-profit organisation based in South Africa, focusing on advocacy, consultation, and training in children's issues. With his wife, Talita, and his colleagues, he's equipped faith actors to work with vulnerable and traumatized children through psychosocial support programs in conflict areas across Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Asia. So Dirk, I know that a large part of your work is about the role of faith leaders in the mental health and psychosocial support of children who've experienced trauma and stress, also in pandemic-related settings, such as Ebola, HIV, and in conflict-affected settings. So we're really excited to hear from you around some practical tips that we can take away around this important piece of accompanying child survivors of violence and building resilience. So over to you.
Thank you, Selina, and thank you for the introduction, because I think the work that you have been doing very much aligns with what we have discovered. So let me jump into it straight away. I have the framework for my presentation. I have 3 things in mind. I'm going to start off with some lessons that we've learned through our work in communities in distress. Now, what we've learned is not rocket science. I mean, SpaceX is rocket science. What we have learned is common sense. Age-old principles, and I'm only going to focus on 5 of them, but I think these 5, they represent a large body of lessons that we have learned that we think are vital building blocks in our work with in training faith communities. All right, then I'm going to go into a short video, because I do believe a video is more interesting than listening to a guy. But in this video, I hope you will discover some of the key concepts that we have concerning the goal and the road. Now, what I mean by goal and the road, the goal is, what does a faith community look like that can act effectively as a first responder? And then the road is, how do you help to prepare a faith community? How do you equip them? How do you build the capacity of such a faith community? I will probably not have much time to talk about that, but at least you will see something in the video. And then the last part will be then just focusing on challenges, opportunities of COVID-19. And I believe that will take us into the roundtable discussion. Okay, next slide. So the first lesson, relationships is the issue. I think this is so, it is so well known, so common, but it is absolutely vital. And this is what we discovered, where faith communities discover relationships as the key. They know how to respond. You see, the first thing is we found that relationships is the source of so much suffering. But the flip side, relationships is the source of so much healing. And this is what we have discovered. Faith communities who focus on relationships are actually making an impact in the societies. Right, next one. Linked to relationships is the whole concept of healing communities. We have our own definition down there. I'm just going to read it and then I'll explain. A healing community is a group of people with an active interest in the well-being of its members, with the skills to nurture and maintain healthy mutual relationships, and with an ultimate purpose to intentionally share this well-being with all members of society. All right, so to start with, well-being of its members. It's a group of people that really care about one another. It's about care, compassion. It's an inclusive group. It includes generations, it includes genders, it includes people, especially the vulnerable. This is the type of group where people who are normally excluded in society will be included. Skills to nurture and maintain healthy mutual relationships. This means the group is small enough to have these relationships between different people. So in a society, you might have many different groups that can fulfill this role. And the group is not all about itself. It's about the well-being of society. So it is an outward focused community. And this is what we call a healing community. And we found if you can build healing communities, they do have an effect on society. Next slide, please. Right, linked to the healing communities are the faith actors. And I put there in brackets, including laity. What I actually should have said is, it is basically the laity who are running these things. Certainly, we believe in professional interventions. So, I mean, you need it. You can't do without professional interventions. But in the areas where we have been working, the trauma and the problems, the challenges are so enormous that professional intervention on a psychosocial level is basically impossible. So you have to equip lay people, faith actors in our case now, but you have to equip them, and they can be equipped. And when they are appropriately equipped, they can play a determining role in the community. Right, next slide, please. Values, skills, knowledge. These things must be integrated in the lives and actions of faith actors as first responders. Now again, this is such common sense, but we find too often that you work with people, they are involved in the community, faith actors very often, and they might be lacking one of the three or more than one of the three. They might have very good values of respect and love, but they don't have the skills how to deal with issues in the society. I mean, we've been speaking about the whole thing of corporal punishment. You would speak to a father and he says, I don't want to beat my children anymore. My mind has changed. I want to discipline my children in a more gentle way, but I don't know how. So can you teach me skills? I'm just taking this as one example, but obviously when it comes to bigger trauma, to violence in the family on a larger scale, often one of these are lacking. And we found you can develop an integrated integration of values, skills, and knowledge through a formation that is holistic, a proper formation. Just a photo there, I haven't said anything about the photos. This is a group of people in Albania. They have formed this community. It's a healing community in so many respects, where they are caring for one another, but they started to have an influence in the village where they are living, because they just shared these values, the skills, and the knowledge that they have with other people who are in need. Okay, and then the last of the slides there. Right, next slide, please. Right, cascade learning, or what you can call multiplication. Intentional process of multiplication can ensure sustainability and reach. And we have found this working so often over decades. If you take lay people with, with commitment, you train them in values linked with skills with the appropriate knowledge. And they go and they start bringing about changes on a small scale in the immediate environment. You can train those very same people to also start influencing others, and they become trainers of trainers. So the whole cascade learning concept, we have seen it working so often. This photo again in the south of Sudan, a very traumatized community, and we have seen how those people, teachers, Sunday school teachers, pastors, other people in the community, how they take those skills and they share it with others. It's a beautiful process once it is running. Right, maybe we can now go to see the video. But just before we see the video, there are some comments that I want to make, and I want to point out certain things. What you will see in the video is a boys' camp with a difference. The video was taken in 2008, obviously pre-COVID, so it is relevant because all the things that are restricted in doing now was still allowed. But I want you to look deeper and to see what you can find in this video in terms of principles. The camp was a part of a formation of facilitators. These facilitators, 20 people, they have all been facilitators in a home-based care organization. They have been working with orphans, vulnerable children, and they have been helping them along the road, but they also asked for training. So we trained them over a period, and then it culminated in this camp. So what you see here is sort of the application of the skills on the camp itself. But this became their model for ongoing larger processes in the community. So that's why I'm asking you to look at the principles in the video. I said that adults, faith actors, 40 of them are officially ordained leaders in churches. And please notice the values and the skills portrayed by these adults in the video on this camp. And then also notice the reversing of normal roles. Now, children's camps, you will often find the children are the receivers of what is given from the front by the leaders. In this case, the children were the primary actors, the adults were the listeners. It also meant that the ratio child-adult must had to be much smaller. So there were about 2 children for every adult, and that meant that the adults could go into this listening role. And then also notice the role of narratives. These boys come from societies, from communities where they just experience this incredible loss, rejection, violence. I mean, I can go into that so deeply. So we had to choose a narrative that was parallel to this. We took it from the New Testament, from the Bible, the book of Acts, chapters 27, 28, and we chose the story of the Apostle Paul, who was on a ship, and the ship was in a wreck. It was lost, and they lost all. Paul lost his safety, he lost his freedom, but basically everyone on the ship lost everything. But Paul persisted because of a deep sense of purpose, and that is portrayed. And we played out this narrative throughout the camp. It was just the story of the camp. The focus was on resilience and purpose in life. So please, maybe Mary, if you can show us the video, please. I see we don't have sound, but this is basically music in the background. Thank you. Can we have the next slide? Yeah, I'm sad that we couldn't hear the music. It's quite nice music in the background, but I think you might have seen something of this camp and some of the processes there. So I'm just going to reflect on a few things. And again, I said we have to look at the adults, the role that the adults play. Number one, connectedness is all about relationships. So the whole concept, everything on this camp was built not so much on the content, not on what they teach, not on what the children need to learn, but on connectedness. And then the adults had to display values. It had to be part of them. And I just listed four there that are the obvious ones. Respect, deep valuing of children. Humility, the willingness to humble themselves, to come down to the level of the children, the willingness to follow the children where the children take the lead, the willingness to listen, just to be there, and not to try and force the children in any direction, just to come alongside them. Openness, crossing boundaries. You know, many of these people, I already said, they are respected church leaders, and they cross the boundaries in so many different ways. And then goodwill, love. This whole attitude of I'm there for you, and it comes from inside. It's not something that I do to you. I am here with you because I love you. The skills I just list four there, which are very vital. Coming alongside, entering the world of these children, being there, it's a skill. It's something that you can learn. Active listening, obviously, plays communication, and then storytelling for life change. So if you saw that these things in the video, this is what these people started to implement in the communities when they were building these small healing communities in the society. Next slide, please. Right, COVID-19 and beyond. We shall eventually go back to a society where there's close contact and touch and intimacy and so forth, where it will be possible again. It might be in an altered form. It might, we might have to adjust over a couple of years to come back to that point. But on our way there, in the current home virtual community setting, the same principles are essential. Connectedness, values, and I've listed those four values: respect, love, the willingness just to be there, to become alongside, and then the skills, and of which listening, obviously, I think is the most important skill. So what do we do in the COVID-19 context? The strategy is to work from the core. And what I mean by core is this small group will have an effect via relationships into the community and home social networks, online training, support, and mentorship. We have embarked on a process with a group of people in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We would have been there already in last year. We have been prevented from going by the insurgents of rebels into the village where we were going. So we had to change to an online system now. And the same things will apply here: connectedness, the values and the skills. So we are building relationships, even if it's virtual at this stage. We are building relationships as much as we can. And then we are teaching the people in this village or in this town, they are all from World Vision, how to pass on these same values and the same skills, the same connectedness to their own communities via their homes, as broad as the networks can stretch within the restrictions of COVID-19 and Ebola. We are quite excited that it is a process. It's not nearly what we wish, because we love to have this close contact, the touch, the intimacy, but it does give us some hope. It can be done. Last slide, please. Right, ending violence against children. What I gave you now was just a taste. It was just it's like sugar on the tongue. Just to say that we are in a movement. There is a large movement all over the world where people are establishing healing communities where children are welcome, safe, and actively involved. It's a cascading process. It is driven by people who shift the paradigms. And I just list here the pride to humility, from exclusion to inclusion, from disregard to deep respect. We are on this road. We have not seen or reached the city yet, but wherever we go, if it's in Central Africa, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in the east of Ukraine, we see signs of this city in the distance, and it really excites us. So, Selina, this is what I have to offer now. And I would love us to continue in a discussion. And of course, I'm looking forward to hear the others also commenting and adding to what I've said.
So thank you, Dirk. I really enjoyed that theme of play and storytelling, and we're going to move now into our roundtable. If there are questions or comments that you want to make to Dirk's presentation, please put them on the chat, and we're going to pick them up in about half an hour's time. That theme of play and storytelling is essential. Is going to be picked up by I would imagine, by our first two speakers. We're going to move to Jennifer and then to Rebecca, who are both going to explore that important role of child participation, one of the themes of the study. And Claves' organisation focuses very much on playful methodologies. So and she was Claves was one of the case studies in our scoping study, so you can read more about it there. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer. You'll see we have 6 speakers here, and we're going to run through each one of those speakers, and then we're going to move to a question and answer session. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Selina, and thank you, Dirk. Like was mentioned, I'm Jennifer, and I work with the Claves organization here in Uruguay. We're an organization which is devoted to the prevention of violence against children, and we work throughout Latin America. And during this COVID time, I'd like to share an example of a way to listen to children and find ways to increase their participation. I'd like to share an example from the movement Alongside Children and Youth, which is a faith-based network which is dedicated to holistic child protection. And what the network has done in this context is to open a space for dialogue and for listening. And the way they've put that in practice is through a short interview with children. This interview has been done with 400 children throughout Latin America, and they're now processing the results of this interview to try and listen and understand how children are living through this time. This is an important time to listen to children's concerns, to listen to their theological understanding of what's happening with COVID, and to be able to put ourselves in children's shoes through this time of uncertainty, take into account their opinions, especially regarding the religious and spiritual matters, and especially regarding a theology of suffering. I think this is a period which has put to the test our own understanding of suffering throughout the world. And so I'd just like to share briefly the questions that have made a part of this small interview. First of all, just asking children, what is coronavirus for you? What is that? What do you understand? Kids are hearing so much from different sources, and being able to listen to what they've been able to understand from this context. What have you asked of God during this time? What questions, what have you, what have been your prayers? What worries you or makes you afraid during this context? And what has made you happy during this time? I think it's also important to recognize that there have been positive outcomes from this pandemic, more time with families, and that can be a very positive thing for some children. And what do you miss about your life before COVID? It's another interesting question, and it helps us to understand what things we need to be able to preserve and give continuity to during this time. And the last question, what would you ask of God if God promised to respond with a letter tomorrow morning? And I think these questions are an interesting way to open up a space for dialogue and be able to listen and to hear what children have to say and how they're processing and understanding. And it gives us insight into how we as adults can form a part of that healing community, like Dirk mentioned, and be able to accompany children during this time. So I'd just like to encourage you all. I think this can be a great opportunity to open a space for listening. The movement alongside children and youth is going to be using these, the survey results or the interview results in order to inform theological reflection and create resources. And I think we can all, it's a mini practice that we can all put into place in our own faith communities. So I'd just like to share that example, and I hope it can be encouraging for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. We're going to move straight on for the purposes of time to Rebecca from Arigatou, who's also going to be reflecting on that child participation piece. Rebecca. Rebecca, maybe make sure you unmute yourself. Okay, seeming to have some challenges getting hold of Rebecca. What I may be going to do, if she doesn't come online in a moment, is move straight on to Neelam from Islamic World Relief, if that's okay. Rebecca, are you there? Okay, I think Neelam, if you're ready, if it's okay with you, we'll maybe move to you, and
Sure.
then if Rebecca comes online, I'll slot her in at the end. Is that okay?
That's fine.
She seems to be having some challenges. She's having some challenges with her audio, I think. So we'll try and sort that out, and then slot her back in a little later on.
Fantastic, no problem. Thank you very much, Selina. Good morning, good afternoon, all. So what I'll be speaking about is support and link the community to resources. We know faith and community actors and international faith-based and non-faith-based organizations are leading and participating in efforts to end violence against children. So there's that's really supported and recognized, and there's numerous resources and tools that have been developed. But what we realize is that they're not always cascaded down to the community level. So how do we ensure what is being designed and what is being developed is targeting and reaching those that need it most? I want to just start off by saying that there's 4 key elements that we should think about when exploring effective communication and sharing of resources. The first being building trust with the communities that we engage, and that's by listening to their views and opinions, ensuring that there's confidential challenges and mechanisms developed through which communities can share their concerns, ensuring that there's active participation by all within the community. Often women are not accessible or children not being involved, so that's a really key critical element. And accessibility to resources and tools is inclusive. Again, people with disability are often neglected. So how do we ensure that what information is being developed and the channels through which we're communicating are fit for purpose? So some questions that you might want to ask yourself, such as, what kind of communities are you engaging? What are their beliefs, practices, culture, language? What is the literacy level of those that you're trying to engage? What is their preferred language? We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so what are the existing communication challenges that the communities prefer? Who are the key influencers that you want to engage from within the community? What are the existing individuals or organizations that are disseminating information, and how could you potentially pool resources together to prevent reinventing the wheel? with COVID-19, we now have to explore alternative mechanisms through which communication is disseminated. We have our existing methods such as posters, flyers. Radio has been very effective and is still really effective. Mosque loudspeakers has been a very engaging approach. And existing community structures that exist during this difficult time are also a really good way of sharing information. But now we have to explore a virtual platform such as social media platforms, WhatsApp, text messages. And what we've done in Islamic Relief is used our existing community mechanisms, which we've established with faith leaders, to share key messages through radio channels, because that from the community has been the most effective and most wide connecting communication channel. We've also strengthened our collaboration with clusters and the Child Protection Welfare Bureau, Child Rights Movement Network, so that we can, again, pool resources together to share existing messages, but also develop messages that could have a wider reach. I'm mindful of the time that I've been allocated, so I've kind of reached that point, but happy to answer any questions. Over to you, Selina.
Sorry, thanks, Neelam. Sorry, attempting to find my unmute button. So we're going to have some time at the end for questions. So if there's something you want to ask Neelam, please put it in the chat, and we're going to make sure we have time for that. So thank you, Neelam, for sticking to time. Some really fascinating ideas there, and bringing in that issue of children with disabilities, such an important theme, and one that's often left behind in terms of whose voices get heard. We're now going to move to Annie from UNICEF. Who's going to be speaking to us a little bit about that prevention, report, refer piece that we spoke about earlier. So Annie, over to you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me, and thank you so much for inviting me to this very inspiring discussion today. I'll briefly speak about the role of social service workers in protecting children, including in the context of the ongoing pandemic. As we know, social service workforce is an inclusive concept referring to a broad range of governmental and non-governmental actors, professionals as well as paraprofessionals, who constitute a broad range of practitioners, researchers, managers, educators, and essentially includes workers from across the board, including faith-based organizations. UNICEF's global experience has demonstrated the central role a strong social service workforce plays across sectors in protecting children from violence, abuse, exploitation, as well as harmful practices. Social service workforce is indeed the most important element of every well-functioning child protection system. And therefore, UNICEF has identified workforce strengthening as a strategic priority area of investment in supporting national efforts for child protection. In 2019, UNICEF, together with the Global Social Service Workforce Alliance, issued the first ever global guidelines to strengthen the social service workforce for child protection, and I'll share a link to that publication. UNICEF implements the strategic framework for the social service workforce that focuses on supporting national efforts on planning, developing, and supporting the workforce, just going well beyond, I should say, just trainings and capacity building of the workforce. In 2019, we saw 137 UNICEF country offices invest in this essential area of work. The ongoing global pandemic of COVID-19 has further highlighted the importance of investing in the workforce that is equipped to respond to the needs of children and ensuring that they're cared for and protected at all times, including these difficult times of the pandemic. Social service workers, child helpline staff, health workers, guidance counselors, you name it, and they all have always been on the front lines for children. And I think the theme of this session is extremely befitting for the role of social service workers. Recognize the importance of social service workers in COVID-19. UNICEF recently published technical guidance in collaboration with the Global Social Service Workforce Alliance, again, the International Federation of Social Workers, and the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. What this technical guidance really does is that it provides key recommendations for care and protection of workers themselves, because very often we talk a lot about what workers must do in terms of providing that care and protection to children. But how is it possible for workers to work effectively if their needs are not taken care of? So this guidance definitely talks about a host of preventive and response actions that social service workers undertake, and which we have listened to already in a number of presentations. The technical guidance actually also talks about challenges and risks faced by workers, including the fear, the stigma, the stress, and the increased workload that workers face on the ground. The technical guidance also talks about the importance of identifying and designating social service workers as essential professionals, because very often, given that social service workers are already, so to speak, invisible behind the scenes, even when there is no pandemic, and in the context of a pandemic like this, the social service workers can become even more invisible. So there is a lot that needs to be done to make them more visible, to create the need to make them essential personnel so that they can protect children. And lastly, the technical note also sets out very specific recommendations for governments, organizations, as well as for individual workers, so that workers can carry out their functions with required safety and protection. So in terms of those recommended actions, we highlight the importance of adhering to the risks relating to social service workers, as well as the ethics of practice of workers. What kind of in-person and remote services can be provided? What kind of training is required to adapt to this new scenario of COVID-19? How do you supervise workers in the absence of that personal and physical contact between supervisors and workers? And as I mentioned, really talking about how do we ensure staff care and the safety of workers themselves. So I will also share a link to the technical note. I'll stop here and happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Annie, and some really nice, I think that theme of training the workforce and capacitating is a really important area for us to think about as faith communities. So we raised that issue about capacity building here in South Africa. Churches and faith leaders are now being seen as key workers. And therefore there's a real opportunity, but also quite a lot of challenges around what does it mean to equip our faith workforce in ways that do no harm. So I think, it's really great to hear comments from UNICEF around all of those different key workers. And I think we need to think as faith communities about the specific role which our faith workforce, its voluntary staff, but also its paid staff, will actually play in relation to children, where we're seeing a lot of bereavement issues come up. Children very anxious about parents, about grandparents, about death, and asking questions often of their faith workforce that we need to make sure that people are equipped to be able to respond to. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move on now to Carola from Queen Margaret University, also part of the scoping study done by the EVAC Hub, and she's going to explore the psychological and spiritual support piece, building on, I'm sure, some of the things which Dirk has said. So over to you, Carola.
Thanks very much, Selina. So I'm from the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, and our institute has a long history of supporting service providers and doing research on MHPSS with children in humanitarian settings. But over the past few years, 5 or 6 years or so, we have focused more and more on how a faith-sensitive approach to MHPSS can be promoted through working closely with organizations to make practical recommendations. And the reason for that mainly is that we find that the MHPSS programming, which is being conducted by humanitarian actors in the field, often make very little reference to spiritual support. And this is often due to a lack of knowledge and faith literacy of the humanitarian aid workers who feel sometimes uncomfortable or unable to respond very much like the the story you were talking about earlier, Selina, from your interviews. And on the other side, we find that faith actors provide spiritual support, but do not have the technical MHPSS knowledge and skills to integrate these into the spiritual support that they provide. So in order to bridge this gap between the humanitarian MHPSS provision and the spiritual support, we worked very closely with the Lutheran World Federation and Islamic Relief, as well as ACT Alliance and World Vision and HIAS, amongst others, to produce the faith-sensitive guidelines in humanitarian response. And this was done to complement the Interagency Standing Committee MHPSS guidelines. And the Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC MHPSS guidelines, as they are known, are the go-to guidelines in the field of MHPSS, really in the humanitarian field. And these guidelines, the faith-sensitive guidelines, were published in 2018. I just want to highlight a few key findings from that. So one of them is that incorporating evidence-based MHPSS practices into ongoing faith activities shows that spiritual and psychological support complement each other in strengthening children's well-being. And this picks up very much on what Dirk was saying earlier. We find that the combination of those really does contribute and complement. One thing I want to stress, though, is that I'm talking about evidence-based MHPSS practices, and the reason for that is that, of course, we know that in the field there are some practices which may not contribute to children's well-being and could possibly do some harm. And I'm talking here across the board, so this is a general observation. A second key issue is the spiritual encouragement and inspiration given to children and their families is greatly appreciated and recognizes that the mental health and psychosocial well-being of children should include their parents and their caregivers, so that children are not seen in isolation and as only the people to whom MHPSS support should be delivered, but they are actually within a context. And also that educational settings actually serve very well as means of providing the spiritual encouragement and inspiration to children and their parents and adults and teachers. And the final observation was just around child-friendly spaces. So these are interventions which are conducted very frequently in humanitarian settings. And there are many that are run by faith communities. And they are able to take religious laws and practices into account and can be run in ways that do not exclude anyone, respect multiple religious practices, and are seen as providing practices and support that are very close to children's context and reality. And here we see faith actors really as first responders and providers of MHPSS support. So this work that we have done for the IASC guidelines did not specifically focus on children. So we've recently started plans for a research project that is specifically focused on MHPSS with children and young people in humanitarian settings, together with Islamic Relief Worldwide and also PARD. And we hope to be able to begin some initial planning work in the next 2 months or so. And we are hoping we're going to be putting out another call via the JLI hub for organizations that are interested in working with us on this so that we can strengthen that evidence base. So the aim of that is to examine what exists in terms of the different types of faith-based MHPSS programs that are out there providing support to children, and to develop the evidence base for how and why this works, because this evidence base really does need strengthening. Thank you very much, Selina. Over to you.
Thank you, Carola. Fantastic. And yes, that complementary approach, so important. And I'm really enjoying the different ways in which we're getting different perspectives. We're going to loop back to Rebecca, if possible. She's had a couple of challenges with her audio, but I just want to see if she's able to speak to us now. So Rebecca, see how you go with your audio.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I apologize. My computer is not working well today. The cursor keeps disappearing, which is really difficult when you're trying to make a presentation. I had prepared a PowerPoint, but I will just go straight to the points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much. I think it's important to underscore an important gap when we talk about the child's right to participate and how much we emphasize that as important to ending violence against children. The child's right to participate is key, in fact, to ending violence against children. And we at Arigatou have been working with religious leaders and faith actors, faith-based organizations on this issue for some time. You will recall that in 2017, there was a conference in Panama on the issue of ending violence against children with a number of religious leaders and faith-based organizations from diverse traditions all taking part, including with children. So we take the participation of children very seriously as a human right. The child's right to participate is recognized in the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a human right of every child. And there are several articles, in fact, in support of this. And I know that most of the people listening are very familiar with this, most likely. But what you may not think about is the gap that we find in that religious communities believe to a large extent that they are enabling and facilitating the child's right to participate in a meaningful and genuine manner, but this is not always the case. In some of the consultations that we've held, we've heard children say, I want our leaders to listen to our opinions and to appreciate them. So when the religious leaders who met in Panama in 2017, they issued the Panama Commitments on Ending Violence Against Children. They issued 10 commitments, in fact. And the first one was on the importance of listening and involving children. And that has been repeatedly mentioned today, on listening to children and making adults the listeners. And also we also listened to the children, insist that adults act on the children's proposals. And that is the third commitment of the 10 Panama Commitments on Ending Violence Against Children. This means increasing our personal and institutional commitments to take concrete actions and address the challenges voiced by the children. And this is more easily said than done. So we are in the business, I think, of conveying this important information to religious communities, emphasizing that children who are silenced cannot challenge violence and abuse perpetrated against them. So when we talk about resilience and empowering children and ensuring the right to participation, then we have to think of children's rights and the child's right to participate as key. So I think that is basically what I'd like to say right now. And I'm really sorry I don't have my PowerPoint to share with you, because I had underscored a number of rights in the CRC, such as Article 12, which recognizes the child's right to participate, beginning with the right to be heard, the right of the child to express his or her views freely, and their views be given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. Also related to this is the right of the child of freedom of expression and association and freedom of thought, and also accessing information that's relevant. And during the COVID-19, we have launched a campaign, including with children. We consulted children. We also had an interfaith prayer with children. And we will continue to engage children in what we do to ensure that their voices are heard. But I have to say, this is a great challenge with so many religious actors indicating that they're not fully appreciating or understanding what this means. So I think that is a major challenge ahead, is how do we convey this to the religious communities who are, in fact, as we know, the first responders in all these emergencies, including the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And that idea really of bridging that gap, the danger that we feel like we're consulting, but actually children don't experience that as genuine listening and genuine consulting. So to wrap us up in our round table, we're going to turn to Robin now, who's going to be exploring that notion of bridging the gap, but in a wider sense between the wider community's formal and informal child protection systems. So over to you, Robin.
Thanks,
And I see you
Selina.
put something in your chat, in the chat
I
as
put
well.
a chat. I put a little link. I like visuals. So if everyone wants to click on that link, this is what I'm going to be speaking to. So when we think about the child protection system, I think many on this call are probably familiar with what we mean. There are both informal and formal actors. So the informal actors, this is where we would often see the family, the community, the faith leaders themselves. We often pin them there in this informal side of things. And then on the formal side, a lot of what Rebecca was just speaking to, we see the laws, the policies, the structure. Where do someone spoke already about reporting and referring. Where do we report? How does Ministry of Justice fit in? How do the police fit in? How does the healthcare system fit in? So all these things, when we think about the system, the child protection system, we can think of both formal and non-formal. And I think it's interesting when you look at the center of these concentric circles, and this is the ecological model, you think of the child, and the child sits right at the center, and this is who we're trying to report. Right out from there, we have the immediate family and the household. I have some background sound. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can still hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can still hear you. I think there's a Skype call coming in. So if everyone else can just make sure they're muted, but Robin, we can still hear you.
Okay. I'm going to continue. So the child sits at the center of these circles, right? And right from there, the next circle out is their family, their immediate family. So this is how we can think of these kind of informal. Out from there, we can see the kinship and informal networks, often where we find the church or the faith communities, the mosque, the temple, where they're going on a regular basis. So you can even see in this visual how the faith community is even closer maybe than the next step out, the formal network, or the policies, the laws, the social workers, the police officers, all these kind of formal actors in the system. So when we think about faith actors as first responders, even in these circles going out, you can see that often the faith leaders are even closer than maybe the formal system. And they can even help to uphold whatever the formal system says, like we said before, reporting or referring, giving kids the immediate psychosocial support, listening in a meaningful way. Like we just said, children have the right to participate, but how does this play out in the communities where we live? And then if we add this layer of being a first responder, what that means, how it means triaging, reporting, referring, providing that immediate psychological first aid, pastoral care, spiritual nurture, these kind of things that really contribute to the children's resilience. So I think that maybe just to say also in this COVID time, as the globe in different countries were facing different restrictions and how faith leaders, faith actors are even a little bit further from children now, right? Even as the formal system has been further from children, right? As schools are closed, children are home, there's curfews and restrictions. How, as faith leaders are playing this informal role, can we help to ensure that there is this reporting and referring, or there is that gap, or even stepping in to maybe mediate if there's a family conflict before it has to escalate up to the actual formal system, and knowing when is the right time to report and refer versus when is the right time that we can enter in and mediate and help to support families. So I think it's interesting to think about this. If we add the COVID layer on, what does it mean when there's restrictions? And as Neelam spoke to, how do we do creative outreach? How do we play this informal role in the system? But then also, how do we step in and link with the formal system when necessary? And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Robin. And that idea of timing, right? That role around being early responders, that it's not only responding when abuse or violence has happened, but being able to understand early warning signs and to know where to go to report. I've seen that people have been introducing themselves and also some really useful reports and recommendations in the chat. So thank you everybody for placing those in there. I see one of them is the World Health Organization resources around skills to respond to violence. So thank you for all of that. We've got a little bit of time for questions, so I want to open the floor. If you have a question or a comment to any one of the roundtable respondents or to Dirk, please just unmute yourself and ask your question. Up on the system, you'll see just a little bit more detail about the scoping study and learning briefs. Yeah, just in case you want to access those, but it's a real opportunity and not to feel intimidated, to feel free to ask questions from your context or to make a comment on this from your own context. So one of the questions that's come through to me is around, and I think this is to any one of the speakers, is kind of around opportunities. You know, we're looking at this EVAC issue in relation of COVID. Like, do we feel that there are opportunities there for faith communities in the light of the specific challenge of COVID? You know, we can see that there are a lot of challenges and many people have raised those, but are there opportunities on which we can build? So I'm very happy to open that up to anybody from their particular context that feels that they want to share a way in which this can be an opportunity for practitioners on which they can build.
I can jump in and maybe provide an example. So it's provided, well, to say COVID-19 has provided an opportunity, it sounds a bit dark. In a project that we've launched in Kenya, Mandera, it's a very conservative context. And we recognize that in that context, faith leaders and faith actors play a very critical and crucial role. And due to the restrictions and limited access our teams have, we've worked very closely with faith actors and faith leaders who have easier access to the hard to reach communities to share some of the resources and to use this opportunity to build and strengthen alliances between different tribes and different communities. Previously, there has been some hostility, there has been some challenges, but this global pandemic has definitely enabled faith leaders to show and provide some common ground for different tribes and communities to come together, and also emphasize the risk that it's posing to women and children, and how communities could strengthen their local mechanisms and the community mechanisms to reduce risk to the most vulnerable, and how to make it a much more inclusive approach.
Thanks so much, Neelam, and for raising that issue, which also came up in the scoping study about the complicated links between violence against women and violence against children, which we're also seeing under COVID. Maybe opportunity is not the right word, but I know in the HIV pandemic here, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, here in South Africa, there was language around saying, how do we see HIV not just as a war which we must fight, but as an invitation for us to work together and to work across some of our historical divides. So maybe that point that you're making about different groups working together, there is in that sense the invitation to work together to meet these shared threats. Glenn, I believe you have a question for Carola. Go for it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. Carola, I'm really interested in, actually all the reports have been phenomenal. I'm a bit blown away here that there's so much really good stuff going on. And I think what I liked about what you said, Carola, was the that we, is really looking for demonstrating that faith-based initiatives actually do make a difference. And I'm conscious that the secular community often look at us and think, we're forcing children to believe this or that, and we're doing, and I think if we can demonstrate that we're actually having a positive effect, then I think that that kind of is encouraging for us as well, and for NGOs that are doing it, that we don't have to feel like that we're hiding away or doing things covertly. So we can do it, proudly, believing that we're making a difference, knowing that we're making a difference. I just wondered, Carola, do you welcome opportunity, possibilities of different NGOs working with you to try and say, because I think a lot of organizations don't have the experience of how to do the kind of research that's needed in order for them to you know, that's really rigorous, and it's the kind of research which really demonstrates that there is evidence, rather than, you know, struggling on their own trying to do it. Do you welcome those kind of connections, and how could that happen?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. So the answer is absolutely yes. So the research I was referring to towards the end of my 3-minute slot is something that hasn't started yet, and is currently being considered for funding for the first phase, which is actually quite limited. The idea is that it's going to have 4 phases, which will involve more in-depth research in looking at examples of good practice in relation to MHPSS with children specifically. So in the first phase, what we're going to do is actually review the evidence and see what is available, both in the published as well in the grey literature, and program reports and NGOs contributions in that. And what we will do is, I mentioned already that we're doing it with Islamic Relief, and also with and through PARD. And we will be looking for, definitely for partners within the faith organization world. So within our proposal, what we proposed that we would look at Islamic, Christian and Buddhist organizations. And the idea was that through JLI, we would be putting out a call to announce that this is going to start, and try and gather some interest for people who have a specific, who are keen to join that kind of research. And then from there onwards to actually build more of a structure around how we can investigate that in depth. So the answer is yes, definitely. And it will be coming via the JLI EVAC hub in relation to trying to generate some interest from faith organizations. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. I wonder if you could put your email in the chat, so those of us who are keen to get to just to start that relationship can do so.
Thanks very much, Glenn. And you know, I think this is maybe a chance, Stacey may have something to say about this, but just to highlight those different calls for case studies that come out via the JLI EVAC hub. There's one up at the moment around young children, and I know we're all very busy, as you know, I worked as a practitioner for many years, but this is one really important way to build evidence from below, to kind of come alongside. So you know, putting in case studies for these different calls does then enable a researcher to work with you to then document your approaches. And I think around this area of mental health and psychosocial support, and ways in which faith leaders are first responders, there's so much going on, we found out in the scoping study, that hasn't been formally documented. And this can lead to sort of a sense in the sort of so-called secular community that faith actors are not as active. So I think it's really important that we do find ways to document those, and this is why the JLI is such a great space, but just to encourage you to look out for those case studies. And I think part of what JLI is seeking to do, particularly in this hub, is come alongside practitioners and help them to develop that evidence base. So really important point, Glenn, thank you very much. Just opening the space again to any final questions. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so just really wanting to encourage people. There's some, you know, people on the call that might not have been on these calls before. There is no such thing as a silly question, so please do feel free. We wouldn't like you to leave having that question in your head that you didn't have the confidence to ask. So please feel free to ask a question and to direct it to any of the people that's spoken. Dirk, maybe just a question for you around engaging with multi-faith communities. I understand you spoke quite a lot about the model, you know, as having its roots in the Christian tradition. I'm just interested to hear, I know you've worked in many diverse contexts. Could you speak a little bit about that sort of working in multi-faith environments? Because that's one of the themes from the scoping study that came up quite strongly. the importance of work, of being able to collaborate across faiths.
Yes, certainly. So our, as you mentioned now, our context has been the Christian context for most of our work, and that's where we have built up our experience too. But we have been in situations where we had people from different faiths together. For example, we have been doing training in Palestine, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, with groups of people representing at least the two different faiths. And we found that when you focus on very specific, as I use the word values, because there are values underlying or deep values in both the faith traditions of Islam and Christianity, for example, the values of humility and compassion, just to mention two. Now, if you focus on those values, people can identify very strongly with it within their own context. And then if you teach them or you show them ways in which they can express those values when they are dealing with children, it comes very easy. So we have found in our training that people from different faith traditions, they just come together around these skills, the knowledge, and then the values. And you know, in our experience, it has been quite a smooth process working with people from different faith traditions. We are also in the process of learning. I mean, we are embarking on a process with Islamic Relief, and I'm very, very, very keen to learn from Islamic Relief how they use the sacred text, how they use narratives from the Islamic tradition to portray or to pass over the same values as we have been doing in our own tradition from the Christian context. So yeah, we are still learning how to do this.
That's great, Dirk. Thank you very much. And I think sort of, again, the scoping study highlighted these sort of potential fruitful collaborations, even around engaging sacred texts. The collaboration I know between World Vision and Islamic World Relief around channels of hope, and you know, the ability to kind of engage with this spiritual capital across faiths, especially if it's hinged on a specific issue such as ending child violence. So that's kind of also a great example. And I know that there's further write-ups that have been done of your model, Dirk. So if there's anything you want to put in the chat group, references through, we've done a link to Petra Institute, which has a number of resources, but I know that you've also collaborated with a number of researchers and academics to actually write up the model around working with wounded children, but also this kind of really strong theme around listening to children, of like placing children at the center of faith communities. I'm aware that that came up from various other speakers, and I wonder, as we finish, whether there's a last comment that you'd like to make around that sort of, you know, that theme of listening, of placing the child at the center rather than the child sort of being on the periphery.
Right, shall I wait for other people to respond before I continue?
No, I'm very happy to hear from you, but if anybody else has a final comment to make on that, this is our kind of moment for last comments, and then I'm going to hand back over to Stacey just to wrap us up. But I'd love to hear from your side, Dirk, because I know this has been a focus for you around intergenerational engagement within sort of faith communities, and I think, you know, Rebecca had also highlighted that as an area that still needed some work.
Yeah, right. I think you started with the right word. It is intergenerational. So that has been our focus for a long time now, to see how you can get generations to communicate with one another. So listening, obviously, that's the basis. Everything starts with listening. But communication, and I think I referred to that, communication has different channels. And we have children prefer to communicate in ways that are not always ways that adults will communicate in, although there's a lot of overlap. And those are the kind of skills that we have been focusing on. How do you help a child to communicate in a way that is close to his body, that he feels comfortable in? And then how do you listen to that kind of communication? So if you have a discussion or a interaction where adults and children are together, you have to allow each one to speak in his language, and then you have to have the skills to interpret that language. and people have to express themselves and you know, in a way that they feel comfortable in. This is not rocket science again, but we find that adults so often miss this point, that they say, okay, children, now you can speak. And then the children keep quiet, and then the adults speak on their behalf because the children are quiet. But the problem is they did not allow the child to speak in a way that the child felt comfortable in. And this is one of the things that we have been working on over a long, long time. And we found if you just approach this whole problem, if you call it a problem, but a challenge, in the right way, with the right attitude and with the right skills, then you can see magic happening in an intergenerational group.
Thank you, Dirk. I think that's a lovely point to end on, especially I think in this sort of particular context of COVID-19 with so much anxiety and fear for children. It's reminding us, I think all of us, of the need to engage with children at the level where they feel comfortable and where play becomes an important space for listening and for communication and for trust to be built. And I think that came across in your video. And I think in future, I'm going to hand back to Stacey now, but I think we're going to hear in the future with a webinar from Claves a little bit more about their play-based methodologies, which they also use. So listening to children involves actually us as adults maybe changing the ways in which we set the terms of engagement and allowing children instead to set the terms of engagement. So first responders isn't something we do for children, it's something that we do together. So Stacey, I'm just going to hand over back to you to wrap us up in case there's any final logistics, but thank you for everybody for listening. I know we're all a bit webinared out, but I hope you enjoyed the content of our roundtable, and I really hope that you'll help us to circulate it once it goes online.
Thanks, Selina. And for anyone who has joined the call and is not a member of the JLI Ending Violence Against Children Hub, I've just put the link in the chat. We do have a few upcoming roundtables. In August, we will be looking at interfaith initiatives and ending violence against children. And in November, we are planning to touch on child participation as well as potentially a number of other topics. We'll be looping back around to everyone who's a part of the hub and also kind of the broader JLI network to get ideas about how to really take advantage of this virtual space. So thanks to everyone for joining.